a century, a towering silhouette against the backdrop of the night sky. To most, it was just a decaying mansion, a forgotten relic of a time long gone. But to the people of the town, it was more. A curse. A reminder of the terrible things that had once happened within its walls. The local children dared each other to approach it, but never to step inside. Their parents would give them a sharp look if they mentioned it, a look that conveyed more than words ever could. Claire Matthews was not like the other children. She had no fear of the house. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses. There had to be a logical explanation for the strange happenings in the town. The lights flickering at night, the voices carried by the wind, the strange apparitions some claimed to see through the windows. But what if, deep down, something inside her wanted to believe? It was late one evening when she first saw it clearly. The house was not as she remembered it. Where before it had been shrouded in mist, now there was a strange light, flickering and wavering from an upper window. At first, she thought it was a trick of the shadows, but then it became more distinct, like a candle burning behind a thick veil of glass. Who would be inside? She whispered to herself, stepping closer to the gate. It was then that she saw it. A shadow moved across the window, a figure, tall and slender. Claire's heart skipped a beat. The figure didn't belong there, but she couldn't tear her gaze away. The figure vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the air around her seemed to freeze. Her breath formed fog in the cool night air. That night, Claire didn't sleep. Instead, she found herself standing by the old fence that bordered Thornhill House, staring at its broken windows. Then, without realizing how she got there, she stepped over the rusted gate and made her way down the overgrown path. The house loomed in front of her like a dark, hungry mouth, ready to swallow her whole. Chapter 2. The First Visit. The air was unnaturally cold as Claire approached the front door. Her breath puffed out in small, visible bursts, and her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from something else, something darker. As her hand hovered near the rusted doorknob, a strange sound came from within. A thud, then another, like something or someone was moving behind the walls. The house groaned as though it had just awoken from a long slumber. Claire hesitated for a moment, but the pull of curiosity was stronger than her fear. She pushed the door open. The heavy creak echoed through the empty halls, and she stepped inside. At first, the house felt still, silent, but there was something about it, something alive. It wasn't just the creaks of old wood or the whisper of the wind outside. It was as though the house itself was breathing, waiting. Every room felt like it had been untouched for years, yet there was an odd sense of presence. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing the raw wood beneath, darkened and stained by time. Dust settled thick on the furniture, undisturbed for decades. But there was something off, some unnatural order to the disarray, as if someone, or something, had deliberately placed everything in just the right spot to make it look abandoned. Claire's footsteps echoed through the entryway. It was almost as if the house was mocking her, reminding her that she wasn't alone. The whispers began to rise. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, but then louder. Low murmurs that made her heart race. They weren't voices of people. No, they were the voices of something else. The walls seemed to vibrate with each word. You shouldn't be here. Claire spun around, but there was no one. The house was empty. Yet, the whispers continued. The light above her flickered, and then the temperature in the room dropped drastically. She could see her breath misting in the air, and as she moved, The air seemed to shift with her, almost as if the house was alive and watching. Then, as she turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind her, the impact rattling the windows. Panic surged through her as the room seemed to close in, the walls contracting. Her pulse quickened and her hands shook violently. Get out or stay forever. Chapter 3. The letter. Claire stumbled backward, heart racing. She gripped the door handle, pulling at it with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. The house had her now. In her frantic search for an exit, Claire's eyes landed on something unexpected. On a lawn chair, by the fireplace, sat an envelope, untouched by dust or decay. Her name, written in elegant script, was scrawled across the front. Impossible. She had never been here before, never given anyone her name. Trembling, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of parchment, yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was unmistakable, though it seemed to blur and shift, as if it were written by a hand that wasn't her own. You've been invited, but you won't leave until you understand. The house knows you. The house remembers you, and it will not let you leave. The temperature dropped further, and the shadows around her seemed to move in the corners of her vision. The walls creaked as though they were groaning in pain. The whispers rose again, louder now, and the shadows on the walls began to dance, twisting into shapes that were not human. The air was thick with something vile, something ancient. Claire backed away, trying to make sense of what she had just read. But she knew. This house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it had been waiting for her. Chapter 4. The truth desperation clawed at her mind, but there was no escape. The house had locked her in, its grip tightening with every passing moment. The floor beneath her feet began to groan, as though the house was preparing to swallow her whole. Then, the door at the end of the hallway, one she had not noticed before, creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room. Claire stepped into it. The air was thick with dust, the smell of mildew overpowering. But the strangest thing was the mirror. It stood against the far wall, tarnished and cracked, yet the reflection in the glass was pristine, as though it were a window into another world. Claire approached it slowly, almost hypnotically. As she gazed into the glass, her reflection shifted, her features twisted, her eyes growing wider and darker. Then it happened. A figure emerged from behind her in the reflection. A woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow, black pools staring back at Claire. Her lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile of malice, not kindness. Claire turned quickly, but there was no one behind her. "You are mine now," the voice echoed from the mirror, cold and sharp. Chapter 5. The final choice. The whispers grew louder. Stay or leave, but you will never be the same. Claire backed away, her mind spiraling as the room closed in on her. The walls seemed to breathe, the house alive with some terrible, ancient force. The mirror in front of her reflected nothing but darkness now. Suddenly, a single word echoed in her mind, louder than the rest: escape. But as Claire reached for the door, the house screamed. The walls shuddered as if in pain. And in the mirror, Claire saw herself, not the person she had been before, but a twisted version, her eyes black and empty, her face contorted in agony. The door wouldn't open. End. Chapter 1. The Whisper in the Dark. Emily Carter had always felt like something was missing. Her dreams were filled with places she didn't recognize. Long, winding corridors, towering doors with no handles, mirrors that rippled like water, and a voice. Always the same whispering voice. "Come home, Emily. She had never spoken about it, never told a soul, because deep down she was afraid that one day she would listen. Then she moved to Blackwood, and she saw it. At the far end of Blackwood Road stood an ancient mansion, its massive frame sagging under the weight of time. The people in town never spoke of it, never looked at it for too long. If she asked, they changed the subject. And yet, the house felt familiar. That night, as she lay in bed, the whisper came again. "You're close now, Emily. Come home." And for the first time in her life, she whispered back, "I'm coming." Chapter 2. The House That Remembers. The next evening, she stood before the mansion's iron gates. She had no memory of walking there, no idea how long she had been standing, but the house knew she was there. The moment she reached for the gate, it swung open. The wind died. The crickets went silent. The world held its breath. She stepped forward. The front door opened by itself. Inside, dust hung in the air like fog. The wooden floor groaned beneath her feet. The walls, once covered in elegant wallpaper, were now bare, scratched, as if something had clawed at them. At the center of the grand hallway stood a small wooden table, and on it, a letter with her name on it. The ink was fresh. Emily's hands shook as she opened it. The words were written in careful, delicate script. "Welcome home, Emily. You are not the first, and you will not be the last." Her breath came short and shallow. Somewhere above her, a floorboard creaked. Someone was upstairs. Chapter 3. The Mirror That Watched. Emily climbed the staircase, her body moving on its own. The air grew colder with each step. The whispering began, not in her head this time, but all around her. "She's here. She's here." Finally, at the top of the stairs was a door. It should not have been there. She knew that because she had seen the house from the outside. There was no room in that part of the house. Yet the door waited, and it was open. Inside, the room was empty except for one thing. A mirror, tall, wide, cracked down the center. She stepped forward, and then her reflection blinked, but she hadn't. Emily froze. The figure in the mirror smiled, but she didn't. And then the reflection spoke. "You look just like me." Her heart slammed against her ribs. She turned to run, and the door slammed shut. The whispers exploded into laughter, and in the mirror, her reflection stepped forward, out of the glass. Chapter 4. The Truth Beneath the House. Emily woke up underground. The walls were alive. The ceiling breathed. She wasn't in a room. She was inside something. Shadows slithered along the walls, stretching and warping. And in the darkness, she saw them. Figures, dozens of them. Some were rotting, their flesh falling away. Others were just bones, their hollow eye sockets locked onto her. And they were all whispering. "She is here. The house is hungry." Emily scrambled backward. Her hand touched something soft. A corpse that looked just like her. Her own face, mouth frozen in a silent scream, eyes black as ink. "No!" she choked. "No, no, no!" The whispering rose. The walls groaned. And then the body's eyes snapped open. Chapter 5. The House That Eats Time. She wasn't the first. She wasn't even the 100th. Emily understood now. The house had been calling her for years, just as it had called the others before her. Each time someone answered, the house made a copy, a perfect duplicate of their body, their soul, their thoughts, and the real version swallowed, buried beneath the floor, a part of the house forever. She looked up. The reflection, the thing that had stepped out of the mirror, stood in front of her, smiling. It reached for her. Its fingers touched her skin, and Emily began to sink. Her body melted into the floor, pulled into the rotting wood like water vanishing into sand. She clawed at the ground, screaming, but the shadows only laughed. "You're home now, Emily." Her last breath was stolen. The world turned black, and above her, the house stood, silent, waiting for the next visitor, for the next Emily. Epilogue, the next one. Weeks later, the house called again. A new girl, a new whisper. "Come home, Olivia." And somewhere in the darkness, beneath the floor, Emily opened her eyes. She was still alive, but she was not alone. She never would be again. The end. Or is it? Chapter 1. The House That Wasn't There. Ethan Holloway never believed in ghosts. He had always dismissed the whispers about Blackwood Manor as nothing more than small-town superstition. A house abandoned for over a century, said to be cursed. He chalked it up to old folklore, the kind that bored people told to keep their lives interesting. But when he first saw the house, standing at the edge of the forest, he realized something was wrong. He had driven down Blackwood Road before, hundreds of times, and yet he had never seen the house until that night. It was massive, its Gothic frame looming in the darkness like a beast waiting to pounce. The windows were black, empty voids. The iron gate was rusted, twisted into strange shapes, as though something had melted it from the inside. The air around it felt thicker somehow, like the space itself was resisting his presence. And then there was the note, pinned to the gate with a rusted nail, flapping in the wind. His name written on it in careful, delicate handwriting. "Come inside, Ethan. You've always been here." Chapter 2. The First Step. Ethan told himself he should leave, turn around, drive back home, and forget he ever saw the house. Instead, he pushed open the gate. The wind stopped. The crickets went silent. The entire world paused. The front door creaked open by itself. Inside, dust hung in the air like fog. The wooden floor groaned under his weight. The scent of something old, something dead, clung to the walls. The air felt wet. The grand hallway stretched out before him, impossibly long, longer than it should be. His mind screamed that the house was playing tricks on him. And then, from the darkness above the stairs, came a voice, low, familiar. "Welcome home." Chapter 3. The Portrait Room. Ethan turned toward the sound, his pulse hammering in his ears. The staircase spiraled upward, disappearing into shadows that shouldn't be there. Something moved at the top of the stairs. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it watching. A door stood slightly ajar to his left. Warm candlelight flickered from within. He stepped inside. The walls were covered in portraits, hundreds of them, each one meticulously painted, lined in gold frames. Men, women, children, different eras, different styles of clothing, all of them staring at him. Then his breath caught. One of the portraits was of him. It was impossibly detailed. His dark hair, his sharp features, his tired eyes, his signature leather jacket. It looked as though the painter had studied him for years. Beneath the portrait, a brass plaque was bolted to the frame. Ethan Holloway, 1892. His stomach lurched. That was over 100 years ago. Then behind him, a whisper, "You shouldn't be here." Chapter 4. The Shifting Hallways. Ethan ran back into the hallway, toward the front door, but the house had changed. The entrance was gone. In its place, a hallway stretched forward into the darkness, longer than the house itself. The walls pulsed as though alive. The wooden floor felt soft under his boots, like flesh. He turned, but the doorway to the portrait room had vanished too. There was only the hallway, waiting, breathing, humming. Then the laughter started, soft at first, all around him. he wasn't alone. Chapter 5. The Mirror That Lied. A mirror stood at the end of the hallway. It was old, cracked down the center, but as Ethan stepped toward it, he realized something was wrong. His reflection wasn't copying him, it was staring at him. And then, it smiled. "You're finally back," it whispered. Then, it stepped forward, out of the glass. Chapter 6. The House That Remembers. The thing that stepped out of the mirror looked just like him, but its eyes were wrong, black, endless, hungry. Ethan tried to run, but his body wouldn't move. The thing tilted its head, watching him struggle. "You were the first," it said, "and now you'll be the last." Ethan's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" The thing leaned closer. "The house brought you back. Again, and again, and again. You never leave, Ethan. You just forget." His chest tightened. Number. That wasn't possible. But then he remembered the plaque beneath his portrait. 1892. The whispers rose around him, louder, closer, and suddenly he remembered. This wasn't the first time he had walked into Blackwood Manor. It was the 1000th, and the house would never let him go. Epilogue. The next one. The next week, a new letter arrived. No return address. Inside, a single note. "Come home, James." And somewhere inside the house, Ethan smiled, waiting, because the house always needed another. The end or the beginning. Chapter 1. The House That Shouldn't Exist. Nathan Cole had never seen the house before. That was impossible. He had lived in Hollow's End his entire life. He knew every street, every corner, every abandoned lot. And yet, on a cold October evening, there it was, standing right at the edge of town, a house that should not exist. 3 stories tall, blackened wood, weathered by time, a tower spiraling up into nothing. The windows reflected nothing but darkness. Nathan had no reason to go near it. And yet, his feet moved forward. On the front door, a brass plate gleamed under the moonlight. Cole Manor. His breath caught in his throat. That was his last name. And then, the door creaked open, inviting him inside. Chapter 2. The House That Knew Him. The inside smelled of dust, old wood, and something damp. The air felt thick, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. Candlelight flickered from sconces that should not have been burning. The walls were lined with paintings. Nathan stepped closer. His blood ran cold. Every painting was of him, different ages, different styles, different time periods. One showed him as a child, wearing clothes from the 1800s. Another depicted him old, frail, staring vacantly. Beneath each painting, a brass plaque bore his name. And beneath the last one, Nathan Cole. His fingers trembled as he reached out. And then, a whisper behind him. "You finally came home." The voice was soft, but wrong. It had a layered sound, as if multiple people spoke at once. Nathan spun around. No one was there, but the air felt thicker, closer. He turned back toward the entrance, but the door was gone. Chapter 3. The Hallway That Never Ends. In its place, a hallway stretched endlessly forward. Something was wrong. The house was bigger inside than outside. His breathing turned shallow. His pulse hammered in his ears. Then, from down the endless hallway, footsteps, slow, measured, coming closer. And then, a knock at the door that no longer existed. Nathan turned in circles, searching for a way out. The paintings had changed. The images of him had moved. Their eyes followed him, their expressions shifting subtly. Some were smiling, others crying. One was screaming. A chill ran down his spine. he wasn't alone. Chapter 4. The Room of Forgotten Names. Nathan stumbled backward. His only option was forward. Doors lined the endless hallway, each identical. Old wood, brass handles. He tried the first, locked. The second, locked. The third. It opened by itself. Inside, a long wooden table, and on it, hundreds of name tags. All of them said, Nathan Cole. The tags were rotting. Some had dates scratched in, 1703, 1821, 1926, 2003. And beneath the pile, fresh ink, 2024. A gust of air rushed past him. The tags scattered, revealing something beneath, a fresh photograph. It was him, standing exactly as he was now, and behind him, in the doorway, a figure, smiling. Nathan whirled around. The door slammed shut. Chapter 5. The Mirror That Lied. A mirror stood in the corner. Nathan saw his reflection, but it wasn't copying him. It smiled, and then it whispered, "You never left." Nathan staggered backward. His reflection stepped out of the glass. It was him, but wrong. "The house needs a Nathan Cole," it said. "Only one can leave." Then it reached for him. Nathan turned and ran, but the hallway was shifting. The walls stretched, distorting like melted wax. The floor tilted. From behind, a voice crooned, "Where do you think you're going?" Chapter 6. The House That Eats Time. Nathan ran, back through the hallway. The house was changing around him. The floor became damp, soft, like flesh. Doors shifted, walls breathed. Then, ahead of him, the front door, wide open, moonlight spilling inside. Nathan lunged forward. Something grabbed his wrist. "Not this time," his own voice whispered. The other Nathan was holding him back, smiling. "The house needs you now," Nathan screamed, and was dragged into the dark. Chapter 7. The Clock That Counted Backward. Nathan awoke in a chair. A grandfather clock ticked in front of him, moving backward. His body felt lighter, weaker. He looked down at his hands. They were shrinking, aging in reverse. The house wasn't just devouring him, it was rewriting him. Memories faded, names blurred. Soon he would forget who he was, and then he would be new again, a fresh Nathan for the house to trap, forever. Epilogue, the next one. A week later, a new letter arrived, no return address. Inside, a single note. "Come home, Oliver." And inside the mirror, Nathan watched, waiting, because the house always needed another, the end or the beginning. Chapter 1. The Tenant. Adam Grayson was no stranger to the pressures of city life, the constant noise, the deadlines, the people who seemed to swallow each other whole, desperate to get ahead. He'd seen it all. He needed an escape, somewhere quiet to clear his mind and restore some semblance of peace after his last project fell apart. When he stumbled upon Hollowbrook Manor on a seemingly forgotten real estate listing, something about it called to him. The realtor hadn't been forthcoming with information. The photos on the website were minimal, just enough to show the bare essentials. A large stone house, a twisted garden overtaken by creeping ivy, and a foggy, desolate landscape that bordered the property. There were no reviews, no customer feedback, and the price was astonishingly low. Too low. "No one's lived here in years, Mr. Grayson. It's difficult to keep tenants, I'm afraid." The agent's words echoed in Adam's mind as he signed the lease and took the keys. He didn't question it. He was tired of questioning. Hollowbrook Manor would be his refuge, or so he hoped. When he arrived at the estate, the reality hit him hard. The house loomed against the grey sky, its windows like hollow eyes staring back at him. It looked as though it was still waiting for someone to return, but its solitude seemed unnatural, like a place abandoned by time itself. The air around the estate was thick, charged with something unidentifiable. Adam pushed the feeling aside and moved in. The floorboards creaked under his boots as he walked through the entryway, a grand hall with faded tapestries on the walls. He couldn't shake the sense of being watched, though. The quiet was too heavy. The stillness was oppressive. The house felt off from the very first moment he entered. There was something about it, the way the rooms shifted in the corner of his eye, the subtle feeling that it was alive. The draft was there too, winding through the halls like a phantom. It wasn't coming from any visible source, but Adam couldn't ignore it. Still, he was stubborn. The cold didn't bother him. He shrugged it off as part of the old house's charm. On the second floor, his bedroom was far grander than any he could have imagined. A four-poster bed, draped in old lace, stood against the far wall, with windows that overlooked the sprawling garden. There was a fireplace, though the chimney looked unused, with dust coating the mantel like a forgotten memory. That night, Adam lay in bed, staring up at the high ceiling. The wind howled outside, shaking the windows. But the draft, it was no longer something he could ignore. He could feel it moving through the room, like a cold hand brushing over his skin. And then came the whisper. At first, he thought it was the wind again, though there was something strange in the sound, something human. It was faint at first, like a murmur, just beneath the wind's roar. But as he lay there, the whisper grew clearer. "Leave! Leave now!" Adam shot up in bed, his heart hammering in his chest. The room was silent once more. No wind, no whispers, only his racing pulse and the oppressive silence that swallowed the house whole. It wasn't the first time he had heard something like that. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, the stress of settling into a new place. But he knew better. He wasn't alone. Chapter 2. The Whispering Walls. The next morning, Adam made his way downstairs to the kitchen, determined to push the unsettling whispers from his mind. He needed to get settled. There was no use worrying about things he couldn't explain. The morning sunlight struggled to break through the heavy curtains that blocked the windows, casting a soft, grey glow across the room. As he moved to make coffee, Adam's eyes wandered over the old photographs that lined the mantel, pictures of a family that seemed impossibly distant. The faces stared back at him, their expressions blank, frozen in time. Some of the frames were cracked, the edges of the glass fogged, but it was the largest picture in the center of the mantel that caught his attention. It was a portrait of a woman, dressed in an elaborate gown, her dark eyes full of sorrow. Her gaze seemed to follow him, no matter where he stood. He studied it for a moment, feeling an odd pull, as if something in the woman's eyes was calling him. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from above. Startled, Adam dropped the mug he was holding. It shattered on the floor, sending jagged pieces scattering across the tiles. He froze. Thud. A second thud, this one louder, coming from upstairs. Heart pounding, Adam made his way up the grand staircase. The house groaned with each step he took, as though it was alive, shifting beneath his feet. He moved down the hallway to the master bedroom, where the noise had originated. His breath caught in his throat when he saw the door slightly ajar, as though someone had been inside. But there was no one. Adam pushed the door open, his mind racing. The room was the same, cold and silent. The wind had stopped, but the sense of being watched was still there. And then, just out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, standing in the far corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. A woman, her face pale, her hair tangled and wild. Her clothes were old-fashioned, a long dress of dark fabric that trailed across the floor. The edges of her form were blurry, as if she were fading in and out of existence. Adam's breath hitched. He blinked, and the figure was gone. The room was empty again. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the bedpost. Was it a trick of the light? Had he imagined it? He stood frozen, staring at the spot where the woman had been. And then the whisper came again. "Get out! Leave! You don't belong here!" This time, it wasn't faint. It was loud, clear as day. Adam rushed out of the room, his legs shaking beneath him. He slammed the door shut behind him and backed away down the hallway, his mind spinning. The house had secrets, dark, dangerous ones. But the most terrifying part? It was waiting for him to discover them. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Room. Beneath the hours after the incident in the master bedroom passed like a blur for Adam. He couldn't focus, his mind replaying the image of the woman, her ethereal form flickering in and out of existence every time he closed his eyes. He couldn't shake the whispers either. Leave. Leave now. They followed him, echoing in his thoughts. But what troubled him most was that the house seemed to know him. It had sensed his presence the moment he crossed its threshold. Still, Adam was not the type to back down from fear. He had always been the rational type, preferring facts over fantasy. He wasn't going to let his nerves control him. He needed to investigate, to uncover what lay hidden beneath the layers of this house's dark history. It was after dark, when the house seemed to come alive again, that Adam decided to explore further. The air felt thicker, colder than before, as though the house was waiting for him to take the next step. The hallway to the left of the master bedroom was narrow, with peeling wallpaper and long-forgotten portraits lining the walls. But one door in particular caught Adam's attention. It was small, unlike the others in the house, and seemed completely out of place. The door was locked, but not with a regular key. A rusted, tarnished lock hung in the middle of the wood, with a heavy chain wrapped around it. Adam couldn't resist. He found an old skeleton key in one of the drawers in the kitchen and tried it in the lock. With a reluctant creak, the door gave way. A cold rush of air greeted him as he stepped into the room beneath. The basement. It was vast, far larger than he had anticipated, and the smell was overwhelming, a mixture of mildew and rot. The flickering light from the single overhead bulb cast long, distorted shadows across the walls. There were strange markings on the stone floor, crude symbols, almost like an ancient language. Some were covered in thick layers of dust, while others appeared freshly carved. He walked deeper into the room, stepping carefully around broken furniture and piles of discarded wood. And then at the far end of the room he saw it, a stone altar, covered in dirt and grime. The altar seemed ancient, older than the house itself. Its surface was etched with symbols that matched the ones on the floor. But it was the strange, blood-red stains that caught his attention. They weren't old, but fresh, as though someone had recently bled onto it. He heard a creak behind him and spun around, but no one was there. The room was empty. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something, or someone, was in the room with him. Suddenly, a whisper, no louder than a breath, escaped the darkness. "You shouldn't be here." Adam backed away slowly, his pulse quickening. There was something deeply wrong about this room, this house. He wasn't alone, and whatever haunted this place was not ready to let him leave. Chapter 4. The History Revealed. Adam didn't sleep that night. Instead, he wandered the house, retracing his steps through the rooms as the weight of the house's history bore down on him. There were pieces of the puzzle scattered everywhere, clues he had missed in his first days here. He decided to search the attic the following morning, hoping that answers might be hidden there. The stairwell to the attic creaked under his weight as he climbed, his thoughts racing. The air was thick with dust, and the moment he opened the door to the attic, the overwhelming stench of decay hit him. The attic was even colder than the rest of the house. Dusty old trunks and cobwebs filled every corner. But it was the collection of books, stacked haphazardly in a corner, that caught his attention. These books, unlike anything he had ever seen before, seemed strangely ancient, bound in leather with dark, faded markings across the covers. One book in particular drew him in. The leather was worn, the spine cracked with age. As Adam opened it, a sharp chill ran down his spine, and a shudder gripped him. The pages were covered in the same strange symbols that appeared on the floor of the basement. But they weren't just symbols. They were incantations, rituals for summoning, for binding, for opening doors to places beyond human understanding. The deeper Adam read, the more the room seemed to shift around him. The light flickered, shadows creeping along the walls like living things. He couldn't stop now. He had to know. The book told the story of the Hollowbrook family. A once prominent lineage, the Hollowbrooks were known for their wealth and influence, until they became obsessed with the occult. The patriarch, Reginald Hollowbrook, had spent decades collecting forbidden knowledge, eventually falling into madness. Adam's heart raced as he read further. Reginald Hollowbrook had performed a dark ritual in the basement of the manor, attempting to summon an ancient entity. But the ritual had gone wrong, terribly wrong. The entity, not fully summoned, had wreaked havoc on the family, killing all of them in brutal, inexplicable ways. The Hollowbrook bloodline had been erased, except for one member. Reginald's daughter, Lilith Hollowbrook, was said to have escaped the ritual. She vanished that night, her fate unknown. But the book implied that her soul had become bound to the house, trapped forever, its power feeding off the lives of those who entered. Adam could feel the room closing in on him, the shadows growing longer, darker. His breath became shallow, his pulse quickening. This was not just a house, it was a prison for an ancient evil, and Adam had walked right into its trap. And then came the whisper again. "You shouldn't have read that." Adam slammed the book shut, his heart hammering. The attic was suddenly much colder, and the shadows seemed to move, following him as he backed toward the door. He had to leave, now. He didn't know how, but he knew the house wasn't going to let him go. Chapter 5. The final confrontation. Adam didn't make it out of the house. The day turned to night, and the house seemed to pulse with life, the walls groaning as if in anticipation. He could hear footsteps behind him, whispers at the edge of his hearing. And when he looked in the mirrors, the reflection staring back at him wasn't his own. It was hers. Lilith Hollowbrook's face, pale and cold, stared at him with hollow eyes. And in that instant, Adam understood the full truth. The house was not just haunted, it was a trap, an ancient force that fed on the souls of those who dared to enter. Lilith had never escaped. She was the house, and the house was her. As the shadows closed in around him, Adam realized that there was no escaping. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed every tenant before him. And as the whispers grew louder, he knew one thing. Hollowbrook Manor would never let him go. End of story.